It's just before 10 p.m. on August 22nd, and 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr. is seated on a Charlotte light rail train. Several other people are around him. According to officials, a few minutes later, the train doors open, and 23-year-old Iryna Zarutska gets on and takes a seat in front of Brown. She's wearing what appears to be a work uniform, AirPods, and looking at her phone. But then, the unthinkable happens. You see Brown pull out what officials say was a pocket knife. He unfolds it, then stands up behind Zarutska. What we aren't showing you is the moment where Brown then stabs Zarutska several times.
On August 22nd, 2025, at around 10 p.m. in Charlotte, North Carolina, Iryna Zarutska, a Ukrainian refugee who fled the conflict over there in order to come to the United States of America, boarded the train after getting off of her shift at a pizzeria that she worked at. However, unfortunately for Iryna Zarutska, there was a man called DeCarlos Brown who was in the seat that she would ultimately end up sitting in front of. Now, DeCarlos Brown has a lengthy criminal history. At least 15 mugshots were presented in the local news media just for this area of North Carolina, and among the crimes that this person had been accused of in his past, we're talking armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, and all sorts of other miscellaneous offenses that, again, should have had him held in detention due to the fact that he was a repeat offender and a serious ongoing offender in society. In addition to that, he was known to the court to be suffering from schizophrenia. So this guy was also mentally ill. He was known to be a danger to other people, and his mother on multiple occasions tried to have him committed. However, the court system in North Carolina, and specifically Judge Teresa Stokes, decided to release him time and time again. And in fact, his most recent arrest, which was not for a very serious offense, but considering it was offense number 14, he ended up getting rewarded by not having to post any bail at all whatsoever. And the thing is, this guy was homeless. He didn't have any money. He had been booted from his home by his family due to the fact that they knew he was a danger. So any amount of bond could have held this guy pre-trial, awaiting to actually get his sentence on those previous charges, and left Iryna alive. However, what ultimately ended up happening was that Judge Teresa Stokes, who, by the way, apparently has not even passed the bar, which we'll get into a little bit later, decided to release him on his own recognizance with a promise that he had to sign for that he would reappear in court when his next date became due. And the thing is, the guy was known to be a paranoid schizophrenic, so even if he intended to reappear and not harm anyone, the fact is, it was only a matter of time before he attacked somebody, got killed, or, of course, did something else that was going to warrant him being rearrested. But this was ignored due to the fact that we have to treat all criminals, specifically black criminals, like innocent Beba Angel Aladdin's, and this ultimately ended up costing Iryna her life. And this is what we're going to talk about today. This particular case, everything surrounding it, and of course, the reaction from both sides to this, because I find it to be ridiculous and patently absurd. But before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Say it appears that Brown and Zarutska did not know each other, and a motive for the stabbing remains under investigation. According to court documents, Brown has a criminal history dating back to 2011, including robbery with a dangerous weapon and other offenses. Brown is charged with first-degree murder.
So there's been a lot of criticism of the judge that released this particular suspect, DeCarlos Brown, without any bail, with just a promise to reappear post his 14th arrest. And of course, there have been a lot of people who have been saying that this person, Teresa Stokes, is not actually an attorney, and questioning why North Carolina actually allows some judge positions in order to be filled by non-attorneys. And I want to be clear about that second part. This is actually not that uncommon, especially in the southeast of the United States from my experience, for low-level judges to be elected positions that don't actually require attorneys to be licensed in order to hold those positions. In fact, on this channel, we've done stories that covered this ground before, and I'll link one of the videos in the description of a place in Georgia that has no such requirement for somebody to be an attorney. However, just because a rumor is flying around on the internet.com doesn't mean we should just buy into it whole cloth. So what I decided to do, since state bar numbers are actually public, is pull up the northcarolina.gov Bar Association lookup, enter Teresa Stokes in order to find out if she's actually licensed in the state of North Carolina. And what I ultimately ended up finding out was that no, she is not licensed as an attorney according to this website as a member of the North Carolina State Bar. So yes, this woman is not an attorney as far as my research has been able to tell me. Now, by the way, if you're thinking that maybe this website is not definitive or maybe there's something wrong with the link, I actually ended up looking up other district court judges using the same search engine, using just their last name and their first name, and of course the state of North Carolina, and I discovered that yes, you can pull up other people's bar numbers that are judges in the same district as long as they're attorneys. So while there might be some countervailing evidence in the future of her being admitted to the bar, it seems like as of right now, she was not actually an attorney. So yeah, this is kind of an underqualified DEI hire, if you will, to this position, who released this person again with a promise to reappear. Now, to be clear, he was charged with abusing 911, which was not the most serious offense. But the thing I want to highlight is that he had repeat offenses, repeat releases, and based on his previous history and mental illness, maybe you could have charged some bond for this in order to hold him, in order to prevent this murder from happening. So I think I have some credibility when it comes to this issue because there are not many creators on the internet.com who have been covering the George Floyd effect, the George Floydification of the United States of America, and of course the soft on criminal treatment that followed, specifically in Democratic states / Democratic cities. I have been highlighting the fact that we have a multitude of these cases where different individuals have been released onto the streets time and time again, up until the point, it seems like, where they do something so horrible that we cannot leave them on the streets any longer. In fact, I actually talked about how this is essentially the strategy in these blue cities as it relates to the Jordan Neely case, who again was threatening to harm people on the subway in the city of New York until Daniel Penny intervened in that situation. And of course, Daniel Penny was the one that was facing serious criminal charges. But just like in this case, you have a known history of mental illness. You have serious violent offenses in this guy's criminal history. You have somebody who is kicked out of the home by family members who could no longer deal with this person. And of course, you have judges that time and time again gave free pass after free pass, only to then suddenly care when something goes down that can't be reversed. And in the Neely case, it was Daniel Penny restraining him, which ultimately ended up leading to his death. However, in this particular case, it was a murder, a psychopathic, unambiguous homicide that is caught on video for the world to see. And of course, there is outrage in response to this. And much of this outrage, 95% of it, is well deserved, as it is aimed at the suspect, as it is aimed at the judge, as it is aimed at the Democratic politicians who are focusing on putting in equity commissions in the state of North Carolina. All of that is warranted. All of that is just. All of that is necessary. All of that needs to be re-examined. And I'll also throw in the district attorney in and around this area for not doing the job of a prosecutor and incapacitate repeat offenders. Again, how many times have we highlighted stories where people are labeled mentally ill? We're told the standard in order to forcibly commit them is when they're a danger to themselves or others. We find out after they murder somebody that they already had a violent history. They've already proven to be a danger to other people, and yet it has gone unchecked. How many times have we called out on this channel all these different various people who say that, oh, the unhoused, they're so mentally ill, and what are we going to do about them? And yet they release them onto the streets time and time again. How many times have we highlighted racial disparities in criminality, which of course is getting a lot of attention in this particular case, and how trying to pretend away the disproportionate danger danger that black people present to other people is not actually helping anybody except for the criminal at the expense of the law-abiding person. And that's something I also want to highlight in this particular case, because yes, there is a racial component to this. There's also an attractiveness component of this. Iryna is obviously, or was obviously, a very beautiful woman. You're seeing photos of her across social media, how attractive this girl actually was, and for her to be stabbed without warning. And by the way, when you watch the full video, one of the things that you realize, and it's actually heartbreaking, is that she didn't appear to know that her life was coming to an end. She didn't appear to realize that she was being stabbed by some criminal, by some thug who should have never been out on the streets in the first place. But again, I will highlight that it is true that DeCarlos Brown did say something about white girl, white girl, white girl after the stabbing was actually initiated. However, I don't need to on this channel play up the racial motive in this particular case, because the guy was unbalanced, the guy was a criminal, he was carrying a weapon on him, and the fact is, he would have eventually done something like this anyway, because the way our system works, the way that it is structured, especially in these left-wing cities, is to give break after break after break to violent repeat offenders, especially if they are black, especially if they're considered disadvantaged by the left wing, and this is the result of that piss poor behavior. This is the result of those terrible policies. And by the way, we see this not just in this isolated case, but across the country. Again, it is so obvious that Iryna should not have died. She should not have been killed. Our public transportation should not endure this level of fear in average everyday people, that there's some psychopath who has been engaged by the criminal justice system repeatedly, time and time again, and given a free pass repeatedly, time and time again. But this is where we're at, and this is due to the fact that we pass a bunch of these woke criminal justice reforms in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, in response to the George Floyd incident. And I also want to highlight the fact that people are trying to turn Iryna into the right's George Floyd, or white people's George Floyd, as many creators on the internet.com have said.
I just watched this footage again. Hey, white America, I think you just found your George Floyd.
Now, whether you're doing cringe monologues like Steven Crowder, or you're posting white squares like I saw on X following the release of this surveillance footage, I need you to understand that if you're engaging in this nonsense, then you are in fact one of the weak individuals who will not be able to lead us forward. I have been on this issue of bail reform, of these woke judges and district attorneys releasing people over and over again for years. I would have covered this story regardless of the race of the victim, because it is the policies that enable the perpetrators that are at issue here. And more importantly, Iryna did nothing wrong. Absolutely not. She came to this country as a refugee. She seemed to love the United States of America. In fact, her family still love the United States of America so much that they're not even going to take her home. They want her to be buried here in her adopted home, in her adopted country. And she never abused drugs, used a counterfeit bill, resisted arrest, or did any of all the crazy things that George Floyd did that ultimately ended up leading to his death. And in addition to that, even if you buy into the George Floyd narrative that he's an innocent Baba Angel Aladdin who is killed by an evil white racist cop, the fact is that is so rare in this country, a white cop or any kind of cop killing an unarmed black person. And by the way, many of those unarmed black people, the 9 a year that get killed by police, are actually in the act of arming themselves or driving a car into the police, as a Daily Wire article ended up exposing. That we should not be making national policy on it. We should not be releasing violent repeat offenders based on an incident that happened in Minneapolis, even if that incident wasn't a complete and utter nonsensical farce that was portrayed in the mainstream media. So no, Iryna is not George Floyd. Iryna was never a criminal. Iryna never did anything wrong. Iryna never provoked her attacker or or anything of the sort. Iryna was just a 23-year-old beautiful girl who presumably had her whole life ahead of her, who came to this country as a refugee, embraced this country, didn't hate on this country, didn't try to tear it down, and she sat down on a light rail train and she was killed by a violent repeat criminal that should have never been released in the first place. Any policy that is rooted in actually stopping what happened to Iryna would actually be good for this country. It would be good for this nation. A re-embrace of incapacitation as the purpose of the criminal justice system would produce many positive results for many more people who are constantly killed by violent repeat offenders. Again, let us look at Baltimore. A lot of people are giving the mayor of Baltimore, and we talked about this before, all the credit in the world for the reduction of homicides post 2023, but in reality, that mayor took office in 2021. He introduced his woke criminal justice reforms back then, and guess what? They didn't do absolutely anything in order to reduce homicide. You know what did reduce homicide? The election of Ivan Bates and the getting rid of the previous Black Lives Matter district attorney, Marilyn Mosby, because you know what Ivan Bates did? Ivan Bates looked at individuals like DeCarlos Brown, repeat offenders who committed crimes with weapons, and he removed them from the streets because he operated under the assumption that if somebody commits a crime with a weapon, like a knife or a gun, it is only a matter of time before that someone who is a repeat offender already established ends up firing that gun or stabbing somebody with that knife. So he got those people off the streets before they were arrested 14 times or the 10 times prior to a homicide arrest that is common in Baltimore. And guess what? The homicide rate plummeted. The man managed to correct an 8-year trend of spiking homicide in the city of Baltimore just by doing the basics, and that's what we need to do across the country. Also, and I hope you guys understand, the reason why I mentioned the previous mental health diagnosis that DeCarlos Brown had is not to endure sympathy for this individual. It's not to do a Van Jones where I say, oh, hurt people end up going out and hurting other people.
It's not about cashless bail or no cashless bail. It's about the fact that we don't know how to deal with people who were hurting in the way this man was hurting. Hurt people. What happened was horrible, but it becomes an opportunity for people to jump on bandwagons. And then for someone like Charlie Kirk, he should be ashamed of himself. No one mentioned the word race, white, black, or anything except him. What people mention is the horror of what happened to this young woman.
The reason I mention it is because we knew this before this crime. We knew this prior to this happening, and the time to address the mental health illness, the time to get him off the streets and get him committed was before he committed this murder, before this action was taken. Oftentimes what the left wing likes to do is exactly what Van Jones and other people in the mainstream media are doing with this particular case, and use it as an excuse to backwards justify criminality, when in reality all of this information was available not to just the judge who let him out most recently, but to previous judges who had interacted with this individual and could have done something about it. Previous prosecutors who ended up facing this guy in court and could have held him to account. He was known to be a danger, but make no mistake about it, the time to address a mental health issue is before somebody gets hurt, before somebody gets killed, not afterwards as a way to mitigate the severity of the crime. So yeah, DeCarlos Brown deserves the maximum penalty available in the state of North Carolina for these actions. This isn't a case of special circumstances or anything of the sort. The man pulled out a knife and stabbed somebody directly in front of him, and the idea that we can expect this guy to never be in a situation ever again in the future where anybody in public is in front of him, either standing or sitting, is absurd. This is the definition of a serious ongoing threat, and he needs to be bare minimum incapacitated for the rest of his life, maximum the death penalty if North Carolina supports it. Now, I will also add that there are some people that are criticizing the other folks on this particular train, particularly those who are next to and, of course, behind this particular incident for getting out of the way of that situation. However, I do want to point out for everybody out there in the audience that based on initial testimony, one of the things that we discovered is that a lot of people didn't realize what actually happened happen until they saw the suspect, DeCarlos Brown, dripping blood on his way out of the train. And eventually, an individual who spotted this girl keel over ended up trying to rip off his shirt in order to stop the bleeding. But the fact is, based on where this girl was stabbed, there was nothing anybody could do in order to help her. So for me, I'm not gonna come down super hard on random individuals at a light rail train station at 10 o'clock at night for not having the perfect reaction, for not even having a good reaction in a snap-second decision moment where, of course, many people don't step up and act like heroes like that one individual and the lady that was with him who attempted to aid Iryna in her final moments. Now, of course, the guy filming it on his cell phone, that is a black mark on our culture for sure, but the people trying to get you to name and shame all these other people that are in frame at the time that the stabbing happened, again, watch the footage and you'll realize that even Iryna didn't seem to understand what actually happened to her. And again, people don't know what to do in crisis situations. This is something that if you've ever taken a CPR class, you'll learn full well, because one of the things that people teach you is that if you need somebody to call 911, you don't ever say someone call 911. You pick a person out from the crowd and say you call 911, because if you say someone call 911 or someone do something, everybody's going to assume that someone else is doing something. However, if you isolate an individual, if you call them out, if you ask them for help, that ends up shifting social stigma. And this is such a widely known phenomenon that this is taught in CPR classes and has been taught for decades and decades and decades. So yeah, I'm not going to come down super hard on the people who just wanted to get off the train. The fact is, Iryna was not going to be saved anyway. And again, you don't know how you would react in that split-second moment. You hope that you would do the right thing. You hope that you would be brave, but let us be honest, many of you know deep down that you would act very similarly, or at least you fear you would act very similarly to the people who just wanted to get off the train. Now, there's other posts that are even more crazy about how people should have fought this individual who had already stabbed somebody. That's also absurd. But again, the overall point is that everything that went wrong in this particular case happened before DeCarlos Brown got on that train, before Iryna got on that train, because he never should have been out on the streets in the first place. Again, 14 prior arrests up until this incident in this particular county, violent crimes in the history, a history of mental illness that was so bad his mom had to toss him out on the streets, tried to get him committed multiple times, and the system repeatedly, time and time again, said no, innocent Baba Angel Aladdin don't want to criminalize mental illness, we don't have enough social workers in order to deal with this, don't want to criminalize poverty, and this is the result of that hubris. This is the result of that ignorance, and this is the result, and of course, it is paid in blood, the blood of this innocent young woman. Now look, those are just my thoughts on this particular case. I happen to be 100% right about this, 100% correct about this. I happen to have been talking about this phenomenon in this country for years, longer than almost anybody else that you've been listening to on the subject of criminality, black crime, black on white crime. But you know what? I'm sure that the random influencer who's trying to use this to talk about how base it is to being called racist knows better than me. So if you like this video, if you like actually hearing the facts about this particular case, then show me by leaving a like. Subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about a horrific stabbing at a light rail station in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the broader implications. Till next time.